For the rest of our lunch, we have a very exciting keynote. You know, one of the issues that comes up consistently, and we've talked about it a lot, is culture. One of the most important parts of a productive culture is effectively being able to communicate. And there's a consistent theme over the years that IT folks just talk about, which is really that inability and the challenge that we have as IT executives communicating to non-IT folks. And it becomes even more complicated and more difficult when it is in the context of a security discussion. I was just talking to somebody and they were saying how a lot of times security is often just approached and sold on a fear basis, and we're trying to change that. So we have with us today Duane Melanson. Did I say that correct? Perfect. Duane Melanson, the CTO from Tripwire, where he owns a critical role in driving and evangelizing the company's global overall product strategy. He brings over 25 years of security software experience and is responsible for leading the company's long-term product strategy to meet the evolving data security needs of global enterprises. And with that, I'll hand it off to Duane to educate you a bit on this topic.
All right, thank you. All right, hi everybody. My name is Duane Melanson. I'm actually out here from Portland, Oregon, where our company is based, and that's a very dark picture of Portland, and our office building's in there somewhere. But what I want to talk with you about are just some of the things that I've been learning and interacting with lots of different agencies, customers, and so forth in commercial and federal world. A little bit of background. So I've been with Tripwire since 2000, and one of the best things about my job is when I joined, our founder, a guy named Gene Kim, was doing a bunch of research and really trying to identify best practices about high-performing IT organizations, you know, both from an operations and security perspective, and learn some of the patterns, you know, some of the repeatable methods that they employed regardless of technology. And through the whole 12 years that I've been with the company, we've continued that on various topics. So I was a contributing researcher to a series of books called the Visible Ops Handbooks, if you guys are familiar with those. There are a bunch of best practices around security operations and integrating the two. And we've also been applying that same kind of rigor in different areas. So we partner with people like the IT Process Institute, some of the leading universities, and spend a lot of time just talking to lots of different organizations, trying to learn what makes them tick, how do they succeed. And one of the areas, like in the last couple of years, a big key focus for us has been based on some feedback we hear consistently from lots of different organizations, where they say, you know, I have a whole bunch of activities I've got to do. And when it comes time for me to go and make a plea for more budget, more resources, and things like that, I have to go talk with a lot of non-technical parts of the organization. A lot of times I have to, you know, jockey for position or budget versus other initiatives that compete with me, and the people signing the checks or approving the budget really don't understand what I do every day and how my organization adds value. This is mirrored by something that we saw in Carnegie Mellon's, they did a recent survey from the Scilab group there. Then they found that 70% of the organizations they surveyed are failing to actually connect risk and security back to the purpose of the business or the purpose of the mission. And I think that's really kind of at the root of this is, you know, how do we have a discussion that is focused on higher level, big picture stuff, not about, you know, patches and CVE numbers and, you know, different things that people outside of our world really don't understand. And so what I want to talk with today is a little bit about the things that we're learning as we interact with people and some guidance and best practices at the end of this. There are also some additional things that I won't cover today. My email address is at the end if you're interested in some of those, and I'll mention them along the way. If you drop me a line, I can point you to some of the research and some of the findings there. But we'll start with, you know, in terms of where I think the core of the problem is. You know, a lot of times we talk about, you know, how we want to connect, protect, and detect, and there's other different, everybody's got like 3 words they like to use, you know, to talk about what they want to do. And I think one of the challenges is because you got a day job and you spend a lot of time dealing with the fires of the moment or the most recent incident or event, we spend a lot of time kind of at the bottom of this pyramid around detect and protect, which is where we consume a lot of our resources, a lot of the clock. Unfortunately, the highest value and the best discussions really come up at the top of this pyramid, which is around how do I connect things? How do I understand, you know, different pieces of data that are available to me? How do I help people understand how to make on-the-spot priority decisions that are in the best interest of the organization and things like that? So one of the things we found is that there are some kind of blocking and tackling maneuvers that are important. For example, hardening configurations, reducing your attack surface, better preparing so that you're less likely to be compromised. And we spend a lot of time on that. We've also had, I'm sure all of you are involved in conversations about continuous monitoring. And you want to be able to take some of the cost and effort out of this by automating, but the downside of that is that it produces so much information, you're now even more overwhelmed by information. You don't quite know what to do next. But the ultimate goal really is to drive better decisions by creating visibility and accountability for the right things across the organization. So, some of the things are like, how do you make that simpler? And I'll go through some things pretty quickly here. Actually, I'll forward here. When we talk to a lot of organizations about continuous monitoring, there's a pretty basic set of steps. Hey, I got to prioritize things. Most of the time they're using like the NIST RMF, as a basis for this to come up and prioritize things. You want to be able to determine what the relative risk of different pieces of infrastructure are, my applications, my data, and so forth. We've got to figure out how often to monitor it and what to do with that data. And then ultimately in step 4, you want to provide some detailed reporting. So I want to go through each of these steps really quickly and then talk about what I believe is the dark side of the continuous monitoring effort. Most of the time we step in when people are starting to categorize assets. And one of the challenges here is that it can be a very manual and very subjective kind of an exercise. Not a lot of people have a definitive source of asset data. Not a lot of people have a clear understanding about service catalogs and service mappings and the relationship between these different elements, whether it's who, all the way down to not only what do I have, but who should be allowed to interact with it and act on it and things like that. Categorization is important, but one of the goals I've seen in high-performing organizations is how do we integrate categorization into the release management process, into the build process, so that it doesn't become an afterthought. Because one of the challenges we've got now is it is kind of being imposed on our organizations, and we have to go back in and kind of do retroactive documentation about a lot of the infrastructure, and that's it's not a very fun project. The next aspect is really to have a good understanding and a discussion around the risk threshold. A lot of people are moving towards more regimented frameworks, and I would say this is one of the areas where I think that in the federal world you've got an advantage in that a lot of organizations in the private sector, commercial organizations just don't have the same kind of love for standards or the mandate to go for standards, so it becomes very difficult to spread information from one project to another efficiently, from one business to another efficiently. So you grow by acquisition, and it becomes very difficult to merge practices and systems. When we've been engaged with a number of organizations that are adopting different risk frameworks from the very complex to the very simple. We've been involved in a lot of, how many people are familiar with the CSER scoring framework? Okay. So CSERS is effectively kind of a broad multi-control scoring method that the goal is really to allow you to bubble up a whole bunch of different security controls and indicators into a small set of numbers that you can track and measure against. And the idea there is that it is to provide a lot of focus and help you identify gaps quickly and hold people accountable for continuous improvement. One of the things we found, though, is that risk thresholds tend to be a kind of big battle in a lot of organizations. How many people have a really strong risk management process and framework embedded in the organization? Okay, a few. One of the challenges that we've seen, and there's one of the pieces of research that I can send to you is there was a recent survey on risk-based security management that talks about the current state of practice across 3 different continents in terms of adopting and embedding risk management in the process. And a couple of the things we found was that in a lot of organizations there was not any kind of centralized ownership of risk management process, so therefore it kind of got battered around and you ended up with sort of this wishy-washy thing. The other extreme is that people try to translate everything into a mathematical formula, and then you have arguments over whether something is 3% more risky or 2% more risky, and that's not an effective place to have a discussion. So one of the things we found is that if you can kind of stay away from the formulas and get to more of a discussion, because inherently risk is a subjective topic. We want to have a discussion about, at a higher level, what do we really care about, and what's the consequence if these bad things happen, and what are we doing to mitigate this? And what I found is that when you go too far down the scoring path and get into like this really nitty-gritty mathematical formula-driven model, that it can be very counterproductive, because you end up spending a lot of time really focusing on the minutia and not getting to the strategic importance of this. I mean, one of the examples I've seen is, if you point, anybody have a cat and you try to point at something to point it out to the cat about where you're going, the cat will just look at the tip of your finger. So they kind of miss the point. And that's one of the things I see when you look at some of these risk exercises, is people spend a lot of time just messing around with spreadsheets and fine-tuning the formula without ever really getting back to, okay, so why do we care about this and what are we trying to do? Let's focus on the bigger picture of this. Another aspect of this that we see is, you've got to figure out how to monitor things, what's the appropriate frequency and things like that. So there's some good guidance. NIST provides some kind of guidelines on how often to monitor low impact, moderate, and high impact systems. That's a good place to start. But some of this gets down to, okay, what am I actually going to do with this information once I produce it? And that, one of the challenges here, if we talk about continuous monitoring, there's a lot of different interpretations of what continuous really means. In some organizations I've talked with, they consider weekly or quarterly to be continuous, and others it's daily or down to the minute. So there's a broad spectrum. So first step for me is to get on the same page about what is the appropriate frequency for our organization based on the risks that we have. One of the challenges with periodic auditing is that what you see is that when it comes up to, we've got an auditor coming in, or we've got an audit event that's about to happen, people sort of kind of clean things up and get the house in order, establish baselines, get you to a known and trusted point. But the moment the auditors leave, things start to degrade. Life goes on, and people are doing their jobs, but you have a case where things begin to drift, and that's where those troughs come from, and that's really where the risk comes in. So one of the things that I've seen in some of the high performers is that they actually move to a more continuous, a truly continuous monitoring state, where, after establishing the initial baseline, they're actually monitoring things very frequently, sometimes once an hour, down to a few times a minute. And then identifying exceptions to the policy very quickly, so that you can deal with things before they drift and before they actually open up a big hole in risk. And we've seen a lot of organizations that have adopted, there are a lot of different methods based on ITIL, based on some of the other service management frameworks, ISO 27000 framework, that are actually repeatable and can help you very quickly deal with a true continuous monitoring state. Because what we're really trying to do is determine a way to minimize the risk at all times, hold people accountable to objective standards, and make it easy to do that and automate it. Because the end game of this really is about providing detailed reports and information. So I'll jump into a little bit more about the dark side of continuous monitoring. So in each one of these steps, the first 3 steps in terms of prioritizing, determining your risk threshold, and determining monitoring frequency, one of the challenges there is that it's so heavily manual in so many organizations that it eats up so much time that you never actually get down to the business of doing real security. So one of the things that we've found is that there are ways to approach this in a more automated fashion, so that as new infrastructure gets embedded in the it gets deployed in the environment, that you can actually catalog it very quickly in an automated fashion and identify it and tag it based on what its business purpose is, what mission it supports, what it contains, and things like that. And what that will allow you to do is actually much more effectively take cost out of the equation by taking some of this manual effort out and making it more a part of normal operating procedure. And then in the last area around detailed reporting, one of the challenges that we run across all the time is that people don't necessarily know what the 4 or 5 key indicators are, so they report on everything. and provide, a monthly dashboard that's so full of data that you don't really know what to do with it. And continuous monitoring can make this worse because it will allow you to create much more data and inundate people with even more information. And so I believe there is a better way. So I'll talk a little bit about where I think some of the early automation opportunities are, and then we'll get into how you use all of this kind of groundwork to communicate more effectively to different stakeholders. So the first area is, there are a lot of things from discovery aspect that you can determine about systems just by, doing agentless monitoring or agent-based monitoring of them. So we can automatically figure out things like what applications are on this system, what databases. We can figure out, what patch level, whether it lives in staging or production, whether it's physical or virtual. So a lot of this stuff can just be automatically flagged for you and give you an easy starting point. Then the next level of things are things that somebody can define for you, whether it's in a CMDB or through an identification and classification process. And these are things around, who are the system owners here? What is the life cycle of this system? What application or service or mission does it support? Does it hold personally identifiable information or health information? Is it subject to a certain audit standard? And if you use that and you create basically metadata around your assets and your applications and your data and things like that, it allows you to automate a lot of the monitoring and policy management and reporting downstream. And what you're able to do is you kind of create all these metadata so you can create different slices of information for different parts of the organization. So I'll give you an example of what I mean about that. In the world I deal in, I'm usually dealing with people at one of three levels, either users who are, kind of doing the day-to-day management of systems and responding to incidents and things like that, or management or leadership. So from a user perspective, they tend to be very concerned about specific systems and test failures and security incidents and things like that. And they really want to make sure they're focused on the right things so that they, basically, I want to get a good rating, or I want to keep my job, those kinds of things. So it tends to be, how do I do the best with what's in front of me? One of the challenges there is that most of the time there's a longer list of things sitting in front of you than you know how to deal with it. So how do we give them the tools to make good decisions without having to go out and guess or try to ask a bunch of people till they get the right answer? You can use this tagging information and the discovery information to give them a way to focus. So they may step in and say, I've got all these systems that have alarms on them, there are incidents being reported to me on my dashboard. What are the top 5 that are failing that have the most value to my organization? And if you give them that view, they can start with something that, there may be other things to do, but they're always focused on the most important things to support the mission that they have responsibility for. You can also give them drill down information that's very specific to the infrastructure that they monitor, because you can do a lot of more sophisticated mapping and correlation back to policies and back to remediation steps and things like that. So this is a way to take people, focus them on the right things, and then provide them the tools so that they're more efficient and effective at doing their job. And it also helps with the learning curve, where if you've got systems that are in effect kind of self-documenting when it comes into incident response and recovery, then it's easier to put a more junior person on a system and actually have them be able to resolve a lot of common issues. Skip that one. And the other aspect of this is, depending on how you present information to them, you can help focus them in the right area. So here's a sample dashboard that we've developed for one organization where across the bottom there are 5 critical areas that a single role is responsible for. And their dashboard starts with not a whole bunch of numbers, not a whole bunch of log messages and things like that, but with some high-level indicators for each one of these 5 areas that they can click around and figure out, okay, which of these looks like it's in trouble. I know I'm responsible for these 5 areas. Which one of these do I want to start with? And we provided also trending information here so that they can see where, where am I and is it getting better or worse? So it's a really effective way to make sure that people come in and they focus on the most important things for the mission or the organization. Moving up a level, when we deal with people in a management role, this is less about individual systems and more about trends and oversight and containing cost and budget, and looking at overall security risk. And the goal here for a manager typically is to be able to manage down and make sure people are focused on the right things, and then communicate some value up. Not tactical value, but really more meaningful strategic value to the rest of the organization. So we can take those same tags, if you will, and present information in a different way, where you can start to break out, how am I doing against my target security policy by different missions? And if you want to make it even more interesting, I've seen a lot of organizations that are very effective in creating competition by taking a static graph like this and then color coding it so that you've got red, yellow, green status on here, and then communicating clearly what the organization's benchmark is. And what this does is, typically each one of these bars is owned by a group or by a set of individuals, and they don't want to be the only ones that are red, right? So it begins to create a sense of accountability where they feel like, I need to take action to drive my score up. I can't be worse than that guy. So there's a lot of kind of helpful benefit and pressure that comes out of this. This is just another view breaking it out a different way. The other thing is that if you start using this as a way to, I don't want to call it public humiliation, but that's kind of what it is, but to present information in a way that makes people feel like they're in trouble without, kind of early. So here's an example where we've taken data, and you can see that, there's an organizational benchmark. You can track clearly how different projects are doing, and you can see where you have a problem. And if you present this in a larger staff meeting, I bet you those numbers go up the next time, because the person down here in rural development actually doesn't want to see a downward trend there. Another thing that we've seen is that some of the high performers we deal with, particularly in financial services, discovered that people were gaming the system by hiding behind waivers. And they had this phenomenon that I like to call waiver addiction, where they just waive a whole bunch of stuff, pretty green graph, And so I've also seen organizations be very effective at measuring and reporting on the waiver. So show me your score with waivers and without, and let's see, let's drill down in there and see if we've got any organizations who are just perpetually waiving things. And it's a way to keep, people, again, and hold them accountable to doing the right thing. Here's an example of how you can roll a lot of this into one tool. This is actually from ING Bank, a financial organization that we've worked with, and they've given us an example where they can actually start with a high-level roll-up about business units. We're looking at West, Southwest, and Northeast regions. I want to be able to see how I'm doing and whether it's getting better or worse. So in this case, you would see that, all right, the Southeast region is scoring lower and it's declining. They've dropped. So let me drill into that. And because you've got all this information tagged in terms of identified who the owners are and who can see this information, you've identified what role they serve, what geography, and all these things are kind of tagged in your system ahead of time. You can actually do this drill down very simply. And then you'll say, okay, now within the Southeast region, how am I doing and where are my biggest problems? And then you can drill even further and find that, within my database layer, I've got problems with both Oracle and SQL Server, for example. So it gives you a quick way to drill down and find where the hottest fire is so that you can actually get some people on it and resolve the issue, particularly if it's going to have a bigger business impact. That's another one. Actually, this one I will show for just a second. This is an example of a Caesar-based dashboard where we're actually pulling in information about multiple controls and presenting it alongside each other. So you can see at a glance, kind of a heat map here of, the things on the left are green, the things on the right are red. I will focus on, access control, which seems to be the deepest red. And it gives you a nice, quick way to present the data in a way that drives some action and decisions versus just showing data for data's sake. And then the third level really is about, okay, from a leadership level, I've got to communicate this information to people who may not have any idea what information security does every day. How do I do that? So one way is to communicate and use this as a way to start, educating them on here are the things we monitor, and here's what better means, and here's what worse means. And then you're able to tie it back to what its impact would be on a specific business service or an application or a site. You can also look at this by owner. But ultimately what you want to be able to do is give people the smallest amount of information possible to get them to ask that next question about, this looks like a problem, what are we doing about it? and let's have a discussion about the cost and the benefit of taking action there. Because one of the things that will help get you out of the weeds is if people can clearly understand how this impacts either my objectives or my scorecard or the success of my project or my next review or whatever it is, the more you can have a meaningful discussion around this. So we've seen this is an example where people are able to roll up at a high level. There's a lot of detail under this, but show me red, yellow, green in terms of how I'm doing across different areas. And ultimately, one of the things that we learned through some of the study of the high performers is that when you're dealing with executives, sticking to small numbers and primary colors helps a lot. And then the more senior the executives, you got to get to up, down, happy, sad, right? So it's so what we want to be able to do is roll this up into something that creates the right level of discussion. So in this case, we'd be able to have a discussion about, this one program, it seems okay. It's not the highest, but it's not the lowest, and it's improving, and it's getting closer to our target. So we're able to kind of see the trend of that. So this is something that keeps the pressure on, but doesn't get into like this accusatory mode of, unhealthy, where people start trying to hide behind waivers and things like that. And it actually, I find it gives people more control over their own destiny. If they know you're going to be looking at this regularly and they have their own slice of it that allows them to manage and hold themselves accountable to improving it, then life can get a lot better. So one of the things that just kind of to sum this up in terms of, some of the best practices around this is, first of all, try to find ways to automate the identification, classification, and risk prioritization of the assets as much as possible. That is a huge superhuman effort, and the more you can automate that, the more cost you can take out and the more you can use those resources somewhere else. The other aspect is try to identify what your leading indicators are. There's a kind of a phenomenon I see in a lot of organizations where they report on a lot of things because they can, or they measure people against things that really can't be directly controlled. Like one of the examples I was talking about earlier today is that I've seen someone recently that one of their objectives was based on the number of vulnerabilities in their environment. That's a no-win situation because those things just kind of happen to you. So what we've been working with them on is shifting it so that we can deal with what they're doing about those vulnerabilities, and in particular, what they're doing about the vulnerabilities on their high-risk, high-criticality systems, the most important systems. And that's a much more productive conversation. I mean, one of the examples I shared earlier was that, if somebody told you, I'm going to measure you and reward you based on the weather, there's not much you can do about that. Something's going to happen, and you may or may not do well on that. But if they said, okay, I want to measure you on the percentage of days that you dressed appropriately for the weather, that's something you could do about. You do something about, and you can actually kind of control yourself, right? So a lot of this is look at your measurements, try to come down to 5 to 8 key leading indicators that, and a good test for that is if this number goes up or down, will it cause me to take a different action? And if the answer is no, then it's probably a tracking indicator, and it's informative, but it probably doesn't belong on your high-level dashboard because it's not going to drive action. So a lot of this is to try to figure out who your audience is, what are the 5 to 8 things they care about, and then give them an easy way to interact with the data without overwhelming them with too much information. So I went through a whole bunch of stuff really quick. Behind this, I mentioned there were some additional resources. Among those are a study on the state of risk-based security management. I've got one that goes into a deeper dive about what metrics are effective, and for example, we've seen success in measuring the percentage of incidents detected by automated controls, percentage of incidents that resulted in loss, and other things to drive more effective behaviors and drive people toward more effective automation that drives cost out of this. I've also got some white papers on more detailed translation of security data into executive dashboards. So if any of that stuff's interesting to you, go forward here. My contact information is on the screen. It's easiest email in Tripwire, just dm@tripwire.com. And a lot of this comes from just independent research, but I'd be happy to send you some of that information. So. Hopefully this is useful. If you have more questions about this or want to go into more detail, I'll be around until midday tomorrow.
Great. Thank you, Dwayne.
Thank you.